pianists and teachers. Today we're talking about how to teach the very famous Minuet in G major by Christian Petzold from the notebook for Anna Magdalena Bach. It of course sounds like this. This is, of course, a very well-known, well-loved piece of music by not only pianists and piano teachers, but also it's included in the Suzuki violin curriculum, and it's been taken and used in many other places. For that reason, it's often a motivating piece for students, which is totally fine, but that also does make it a little bit hard for our students to always play it at the right time in their development and to play it artistically. So we're going to talk about a lot of those things. I also want to tell you why I do like teaching this piece, even though it is frankly overplayed and poses some difficulties. But first, if we haven't met before, my name is Jana Williamson, and welcome to my home piano studio in the suburbs of Chicago. So I like teaching this piece because yes, it is motivating for students who want to play something recognizable like this. It's a really nice example of cantabile Baroque style, almost thinking, pre-classical with the more clear, even melodies that we find in Mozart and other classical composers. It's a great example of basic counterpoint of, two independent voices between the two hands. And for that reason, it's great practice for coordination and left-hand work. And one of my other reasons why I love this piece is that it shows up in so many different books, both beginning method series as well as intermediate repertoire series, that it is a great piece for helping you see how different editors think about skills and concepts and leveling. And if you haven't checked out my Method to Masterworks resource yet, I would love for you to go right to the description now and click on the link there. It is a spreadsheet plus a video that talks all about moving students from the method book to intermediate repertoire and thinking about that leveling using pieces like this Minuet to help us know what editors and publishers have done. So to give you a little taste on all of the books that this shows up in, I am currently looking at this in the Urtext edition of the notebook for Anna Magdalena Bach, and I will link to that in the description of the video if you'd like to order that, because I do strongly recommend owning an Urtext of Baroque materials, and particularly this notebook. It's a great resource to have. But as far as student materials go, this shows up in the Piano Adventures Curriculum, Performance 3B, the Alfred Premier Method, Lesson Book 5, Masterwork Classics, Level 3, Keith Snell's Piano Repertoire, Level 2, Journey Through the Classics by Jennifer Lynn, Book 2, and the Faber Developing Artist Piano Literature, Book 2. So there are a lot of choices, and I'm guessing if you've taught for any period of time, you've taught at least one, if not multiple of those books or series of books in your time. Now that said, this is a particularly problematic piece when done in a student edition as far as editing goes, because if you look at the Urtext, there is nothing there besides the pitches. There are no dynamics and no articulation markings, and that's one of the main reasons I like to own the Urtext for these pieces, also things like the Bach Inventions, is because it's helpful for me to go back to the basics and remember, what did the composer actually write? And I find that this particular piece in student editions is often, in my opinion, overly edited with slurs. It's one of the few pieces that I don't really appreciate Jane McGraw's editing on in her Masterwork Classics books. I just think there's too many slurs. And one of the examples of that is that many of the editions will have a slur in places like measure 2 and 4 after the downbeat. But I actually like to play those quarter notes detached. Now you can completely disagree with me on this point, but I'll give you a little sales pitch for this. So I like to play this like this. So those detached quarter notes. One of the reasons for that is that there is an octave on the downbeat of measure 4. And that can be very difficult for a younger child or a smaller handed pianist to actually play slurred, to play legato. I also find that later on we get this motive, measure 5. And I really like to detach after that quarter note, like that's where you take the breath. So I find that if I'm going to detach there, it makes sense to detach on some of those other downbeats. Now again, as I said, if you like the feeling of the slur from beat 1 to 2 because you like how that gives a little emphasis to beat 1, that would be a perfectly reasonable expressive choice. I'm just telling you why I like it the other way and why I find a lot of articulation markings in student editions difficult. And that's why I, again, own the text. To just sum up that idea about articulation, you as the performer, when playing a Baroque piece, get to decide what articulation you want to use. It needs to be an informed choice that makes sense and that isn't arbitrary, but you do ultimately get to decide. So if your student is using a student edition like Jane McGraw's Masterwork Classics or Keith Snell's piano repertoire, then just remember you have the option to cross out some of the slurs and to tell them to lift at a certain point. It's difficult visually for students to do that, particularly if they're conscientious students who like to follow the markings on the page. But you do actually have that right, and you can show them the text in order to show them that Christian Petzold did not actually write those slurs. Let's move on from articulation. Let's talk about some other things that our students need to know. This is in G major, so students need to understand G major scales and the key signature. We do get a lot of scale-like patterns, little mini scales throughout the whole piece. They also need to understand D major, as that's the dominant, and there is just a straight up D major scale starting on A in measure 21. So remember, scales don't have to start on the tonic note in order to be that scale. I don't have to start on D for it to be a D major scale. It just has to have the right pitches in it. So in that case, F sharp and C sharp, and that's what happens in measure 21. Same thing, we get the G major scale in 29. That's G major because of the C natural there, and we're definitely back to G there at the end of the piece. This is, of course, written in a basic contrapuntal style, meaning that it's not chords in one hand or some sort of accompaniment pattern like Alberti bass. It's written as an individual note melodic type line in the left hand. Now, with the more basic the counterpoint, such as these easiest minuets, the more simple the left hand part is, and the more it feels a little bit like the left hand is accompanying the right hand, with the right hand having the more intricate melody. But this still is a precursor for things like inventions or fugues, and that means that the left hand is just more intricate than other pieces you might find at a similar level. Therefore, students need to do a lot of left hand practice alone, and they need to use good fingering choices. So whatever edition you're using, Urtext or otherwise, make sure you like the fingering and that you help the student. If they need to add a few finger numbers in their book, by all means add them and ask them to be consistent so that the hands can work in a coordinated manner using good fingering. One typical problem spot in this piece is down at the end. We have measure 25, 26, and then in 29, the left hand suddenly has two voices, and students get very confused by these rests over a half note and an extra half note, and they start thinking there's like 5 beats in a measure instead of 3. What that means, that's as if you had a bass line and a tenor line both existing on the staff. It still needs to happen within 3 beats. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You're just supposed to hold those half notes as you continue through the measure. Same thing in measure 29, hold the dotted half note, 1, 2, 3, and then lift at the end. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I would, before I probably dug too deep into the left hand on this, I would make sure students understand that, because I have too many times sent a student home and said, okay, learn the left hand alone on this part, and they come back and they've got 5 beats in the measure instead of 3 because it visually doesn't make sense, and they haven't encountered yet 2 voices in one staff. This is a minuet. Minuets are in 3/4 time, and they are usually pretty gentle pieces with a gentle emphasis on beat 1. You can very easily feel it in this piece. It seems really natural given how many times we have the rhythmic motive of quarter note plus 4/8 notes. If I look at measure 17, where you have that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It is not as dramatic as a waltz. A waltz dance would have been much more dramatic with more movement, bigger steps, bigger dresses, of course, too, and tuxedos and top hats for that time period in the 19th century. Minuets precede that, and it would have been more of a gentle emphasis on beat 1, but it still needs to have that. You can really instill this in your student very simply by doing some basic movement, even just sitting on the bench. If your student is the kind who doesn't want to get up and dance around the room, you can do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, or with your hands doing a patty cake kind of motion, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, where the beat 1 is a different motion. You can also move around the room and step 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, saying that with your voice and just having a little bit of a bigger or fuller step on the downbeat. Students can often overdo this by putting a harsh accent on B1. We don't want that. But when they're playing hands separately, which they should do plenty of practice on a contrapuntal piece like this, you can just draw their ears to thinking 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And that gives it such a beautiful lilt, and it sounds like a minuet then. Since I was just demonstrating with the second half of this piece, I think it's worthwhile mentioning that most people have in their oral memory the first half of this piece. They know how the beginning goes, and they don't know as well measure 17 to the end. So many times when I've taught this, students will learn the first half, and then we kind of slog through the second half. So warn your student when they begin this, you'll have to do a little extra practice on the second half. Let's make sure we don't ignore it. No convenient forgetting to practice the part that's less familiar. Maybe even consider starting your student with the second half, knowing that they will also go home and play the beginning. Or maybe in your lesson, you just begin your time with this, hey, let's start in measure 17 and see how that's going. And then you can have the reward of going back to measure 1 and seeing how the easier part feels. This piece very easily separates into 4 bar sections, so you can very easily just have those 4 sections in the second half, 4 sections in the top half. 4 times 4 equals 16. It's a very balanced and even little composition. I would advocate for section practice. Play your right hand twice, measure 17 through 20. Play your left hand twice, measure 17 through 20. And then practice hands together a number of times until you can do the coordination. Just one quick note about ornaments in this piece. In the text, there are some ornaments written, mostly these little mordents. They show up in measure 3, 5, 11, 13. Those are optional, and most student editions do not include them. But a mordent, which is the little wiggly line with the vertical slash through it, starts on the printed note, the principal note, goes down and comes back up. So if you played measure 3, 4, 5 with the mordents, it would sound like this. Most student editions also realize the appoggiatura in measure 8. Most of them realize it as a quarter note with a half note. And appoggiatura looks a little bit like a grace note. It's a non-harmonic tone that occurs on the downbeat or on a strong beat and is dissonant and then resolves. It's a very satisfying feeling. It's dissonant and then you go, I hope that gives you a few ideas on how to teach the very famous Minuet in G by Christian Petzold, formerly attributed to Bach because it's from the notebook for Anna Magdalena. If you enjoyed this video, would you please hit the like button and share it with a colleague or friend? I would really appreciate it. Don't forget to go into the description to find links to all the editions I mentioned, as well as information about my Method to Masterworks resource. I wish you all the best in your teaching.